Inspiring, educating, and at times, entertaining. This is the Retirement Years Podcast with your hosts, Mary Ellen French and Dave Wing.
Hi there, I'm Mary Ellen.
And I'm Dave, and today we'll bring you part 2 of our interview with Joe Curry. And as you may recall, Joe is a certified financial planner who owns and operates an investment firm in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, called Matthews and Associates. Joe specializes in financial planning for those about to retire and also for those already enjoying retirement.
So on our last episode with Joe, he described how the Retirement Navigator can help you organize your financial planning for retirement. And you remember that it starts with exploring what you feel are your values and then walks you into thinking about your purpose. And then that from there, you establish some goals. So if you weren't with us last time, the Retirement Navigator can be found at Joe's website, retirementplanningsimplified.ca. And it's an awesome free resource for you to check out.
In our conversation with Joe for today's episode, he goes further into how to plan and manage your wealth, that wealth that you will rely on in retirement. And while we sometimes believe that financial planning and investment income is too complicated, I can assure you that a financial planner, much like Joe, can even help Mary Ellen and I understand some of the basics you need to be considering about your retirement income. So it can't be that complicated.
I remember the first time I sat down with a financial planner actually was shortly after I started my first job. And I started putting money into an RRSP. I was single. I paid off my student debt. And then, as life went on, I stopped contributing to the RRSP because I didn't have that extra money. And I really only checked in with my financial planner sort of every couple of years at that point, because really I just let the money sit and grow. And you're going to hear Joe talk about that more today, the idea of investment income, investment planning, and retirement income. And he's also going to share some really good advice around preparing the legacy that you want to leave behind for those who mean the most to you. So last time when we talked to you, Joe, we talked about a retirement planning tool that you developed called the Retirement Navigator. And this guide, listeners will remember, is intended to simplify your retirement savings while focusing on identifying your values and your purpose in your retirement life. So, Joe, welcome back.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, guys.
So, Joe, the final 2 parts of the Retirement Navigator deal with retirement income and investment planning. And earlier in the process, the individual using the Navigator would look at income that they'd have after retirement, their expenses, those sorts of things. If it looks like money's going to be an issue, you boil it down to 2 choices, and you can tell us about those choices.
Yeah. So lots of times when people are doing this planning, they're pretty close to retirement. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room. So really it is work longer. Obviously, that allows you to let any savings you do have grow longer. You're not taking out and you have more opportunity to save. Alternatively, you could spend less. And for some people, maybe that's okay. But those really are the 2 options you have if you've left it right to the end, right? So now if you're looking at this a little further out, then you have some additional options, right? So you can spend less, work longer, save more, right? So it gives you a little bit more what we call retirement levers. But yeah, it's not rocket science. There's really just a couple options.
Joe, you use the term 4% rule when you're looking at someone's income portfolio. Can you explain more about what that is?
Yeah, so this is, we'll call it a rule of thumb, probably is the best way of putting it. And so, there was an advisor in the 90s. He did a lot of research. So he built some, retirement portfolios, and then he took market data. So this is out of the US, but it holds pretty true kind of globally. And so anyway, he went back, looked at market data through history, and he looked at, how much could someone take from their portfolio on an annual basis and not run out of money in a 30-year period. So that's assuming, so just to make this really simple, you had $1 million, 4% of that is $40,000. So you're going to start with $40,000 withdrawal from your portfolio each year. You would increase that by inflation each year. And then at that point, based on history, you could do that for any 30-year period where kind of the market data went back to, which is probably like 1926. So the 4% rule isn't kind of the end all be all, but I've used it in the Navigator because it's a good starting point, right? So if you're not working with a planner at this point, and you're trying to go through the Navigator to figure out, well, how much could I rely on from my investments? If you need a lot more than 4%, then you probably need to work longer or spend less at the end of the day, right? So it's really a starting point, and there's planning we could do beyond that to help you maybe get a little bit more out of your money, depending on your comfort level and some different perspectives, I guess. But as someone who's just trying to figure out, am I in the ballpark for being able to retire? That's where the 4% rule comes in the way that I use it.
And there's lots of variables, right? Like that's a starting point, and it kind of simplifies it, which is the point of the service you can provide to me as I'm planning my retirement. You can make it easier for me to understand. Currently, though, we're kind of in uncharted waters for a long time in inflation. And then there was the housing boom that some people have been left kind of mortgage poor, where you've probably seen this. I don't have to tell you this, but where, the nest egg was the home, the equity in the home. And now that's all over the place because some overpaid, some got mortgage rates that weren't favorable or whatever. So even that's difficult because you find yourself in, I'd like to sell this home, but the mortgage I'd have to take changes the game. So downsizing, it's almost more of a lateral than downsizing. So that's another reason to go in and talk to someone like yourself. We mentioned to you that both of us were educators in our careers, and therefore we love visuals. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the money one may have to invest for the future retirement, you describe that money as being in 3 buckets. And I like that because I get that. There's a bucket, there's a bucket, there's a bucket. So can you tell us a little bit about what are those buckets and what do they mean as far as my wealth?
Sure. So I'll narrow this down to 2 buckets, which is probably as far as when we're kind of thinking of our portfolio. And I guess another bucket's going to be, you have all these different fixed income pieces coming in. Everyone's going to look a little bit different, but if you're in Canada, you probably have Canada Pension Plan. If you worked, old age security, and like in your case, both of you being educators, you had defined benefit pensions. Right. So this is giving you a kind of an ongoing income stream. But then we need to figure out how are we filling the gaps. So we talked about this on your last episode that we did together. And the gaps in your spending needs to probably come from a portfolio. So assuming that you don't take that and purchase an annuity where you kind of take all the risk off of your plate. And one of the downsides to buying an annuity would be then that you don't have access to that money and your kids wouldn't get that money. But so we're assuming you keep this in a portfolio that you want to generate income for you for the next 30 or 40 years. So a lot of people, what they say to me is, hey, Joe, like I understand that, we'll say stocks, for example, long-term is a good way to make money, but I don't have long-term because I'm retired now, or I'm going to be retiring in the next couple of years. So this is where the buckets really come into place. If we think of your time horizon, you really have 2 time horizons, right? You have your short-term spending needs, but you also might be retired for another 30 or 40 years. So you still have a long-term horizon. And so the key thing that we want to do is we want to make sure we have money that's set aside in what I call the defense bucket that is going to be able to kind of weather the storm of difficult markets. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so that bucket, if I were to break that bucket up, you might even have a couple components in it. So you could have some cash, like high interest savings in there, which is more immediate term spending. And then you might have, you could use some GICs, you could have bonds, but again, something that is going to get you a little bit more interest than just having cash, but also is not going to have the same type of what we would say volatility as stocks. And so what I mean by volatility is those ups and downs of the value. And so ideally, if we go back through time, if we go back to 2008, for example, if you had put money in at the very peak of the market right before everything crashed in 2008, and you looked at where your value was at that point, and we fast forward approximately 5 years, that's about how long it would have took for your stock portfolio to recover on average. Okay, so there's a 5-year period there. And so basically what you don't want to do is you don't really want to invest money in something like stocks that you're going to need to use in the next 5 years, because it could not be there or not be there to the extent that you put it in when you needed to use it. And so being in retirement and the fact that, a lot of people don't want to go back to work, we might want to be a little bit more conservative on that, right? So we might push maybe a few more years than 5 in case we get something worse than 2008, God forbid. Yeah. And so anyway, so that's your defense bucket. And really what you're doing in retirement, so once you flip over to retirement, is you're going to start taking an income to fill that gap, again, that's not covered by your defined benefit pensions or government benefits. And that's should be coming out of your least risky asset, being your cash or high interest savings. And so you basically just have money flowing from there. This is typically how it would go for, so someone in your situation might be a little different. If you have enough coming in from your defined benefit pension, you might be more taking lump sums. You might not have a regular ongoing paycheck from your investments, so to speak. But a lot of people are going to rely on that to meet their income. So you just set it up so it's automatically coming out of cash, going into your bank accounts. You have a paycheck just like when you're working. And then on a regular basis, what we need to do is we need to top that up because it's disappearing as you're taking money out of there, right? And also thinking about the long term, we need to have money growing. So for most people, they're going to need to get some growth above and beyond inflation from their portfolio so that they continue to have an income all the way through their retirement. And so that's where the offense bucket comes in. And so typically an offense bucket, for us would be, a bucket of globally diversified companies, not putting a whole lot of risk into any one company or any one sector or any one country, because we don't want to take any undue risk. So very diversified, because at the end of the day, unless something happens to capitalism, which anything could happen, but markets work over time. Again, it's those shorter term periods where we tend to get ourselves in trouble if we're investing money we want to use in the next couple of years. So knowing we have this other bucket set aside for our longer term money on a regular basis, this could be annually, semi-annually. What we want to look at is how is our portfolio doing? And if our growth bucket or offense bucket has been growing, then we want to take some of that. So sell some of that while it's high, and we want to replenish the cash that we've been spending. So we keep that cash for short-term needs, right? Now, the flip side of that is there are periods like 2022, for example, where stocks are down, right? And so most people, their portfolio of globally diversified stocks would have been down in 2022. So in that case, what we could do is we could just leave it and let it recover and keep taking money out of that defense bucket, because ideally we've set aside, a number of years there. But what the evidence would tell us we actually should do is we should take some of our defense bucket and we should buy some stocks to get us back to where we started. And so really when we're building a portfolio, we're building in the original portfolio in terms of number of years, like how many years we want to have set aside, but that's going to give us a percentage of your portfolio we want to have in stocks versus your defense bucket, or offense versus defense. And so really what we're doing is when our offense bucket is down, we're going to be taking money from our defense bucket to replenish the offense bucket while it's low, so that we have money there to grow when it recovers. And so the perfect example of that is actually the pandemic. So during the pandemic, in about a 6-week period, markets were down roughly 35%. And so if we rebalance during that period into our offense bucket, stocks had fully recovered basically by the end of May. And so this is March, we hit the bottom. Into May, we've already recovered, and the year ended up actually positive in 2020. Mm-hmm. So by rebalancing, we were way further ahead than just waiting it out and letting it recover, which would have worked as well. We just wouldn't be quite as far ahead. And for someone who's really conservative, I mean, we still have that option, because you have your defense bucket where you set aside a number of years where you could just keep it out of there. Because more important than the most optimal decision is the decision that you can stick with, right? Because if we blow up the plan in the middle of the pandemic, then none of it ever matters at all, right? So if the plan based on the individual is to be more conservative, I mean, we can go into it with that thinking. But the main thing is understanding that a 30 or 40 year retirement, for most people, a portfolio of GICs is not going to cut it. You need to get some growth. And so that's why we think of it, and you have a long-term horizon and a short-term horizon, and separating that into buckets.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So those would be the risks that you need to consider when planning your financial future.
Yeah. Specifically when it comes to the investment piece. Exactly.
Yeah.
So Joe, we discussed on the podcast about leaving a legacy And it actually was one of our more popular episodes as well, I think. What are the top 2 or 3 things everyone should do to prepare for leaving a legacy behind for family, friends, charities, that sort of thing? Because that must come up in this planning, the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important piece of financial planning is taking care of that estate piece. And the first thing is understanding what your goals are, right? And for some people that there isn't really a goal there. It's just like, you know what, I helped my kids through college, and I fed them for 20 years, and whatever's left is left, and that's fine. Yeah. But for other people, there's specific goals there, or maybe it is a charity, things like that. So step number 1 is getting clear. And that really starts with what we've talked about in the past is your values, right? So kind of getting clear on the values, and then from there, kind of stemming that into what are your specific goals. So that's kind of number 1. Number 2 then is, and maybe you can do this on your own through research. It's probably helpful to talk with a financial planner, someone who kind of deals in the space, or even an estate lawyer, estate attorney. But starting to think about, once you have the goal, what options are available, right? So you can leave specific gifts through your will. And that could be like a specific gift. Also, it could be through the residual of your estate, right? Making sure the kids are getting a certain amount, and we want, the leftover to go to a charity. And again, it could be the opposite. A certain amount goes to charity, and everything's split between the kids, right? Whatever that piece looks like. If we're talking about real estate, like the family cottage, for example, when we have more than one piece of real estate, we need to be very cognizant of the tax consequences that kind of come with trying to keep that in the family, right? So most people know if they sell their primary residence, they don't have to pay tax on that. So, if you bought it for $500,000 5 years ago and today's worth $1 million, and it's your own house, then, you don't have to pay tax if you sell that. But if you have a cottage that at the same time that was also growing, anything above and beyond what you paid for it and value, so that growth is a capital gain, and 50% of that will go into your income when you pass away. If it's a couple upon the survivor passing, so 50% of that goes into your income, and it creates taxes. Which, with the way that real estate, particularly cottages, have gone up in the last number of years, I mean, there's some substantial tax liabilities there that a lot of people haven't really given thought to how they're going to deal with that. So again, through some planning, there's some ideas or ways that you maybe can address that. So once you've kind of addressed some of the different ways that you could be leaving a legacy and you're clear in your goals, when it comes to family, it's also really important to have like a family meeting. So a lot of people don't want to talk to their kids about what's going to happen when something happens to them. So whether it's they don't want to talk about death, or they don't want their kids to get any ideas, or whatever it is, I'm not sure, but a lot of people don't like having those conversations or don't want to. But it's really important to have those conversations, and making sure they understand why you're doing things the way you're doing, what your goals are. And that's not just about leaving a legacy. It's also when it comes to like, who are you making the executor or the powers of attorney? Like a lot of people, if they're not the executor, but their sibling is, they take offense to that. And I would actually say you should be grateful.
Grateful. Yes.
Yeah.
To not be the executor. But the point is that without some communication there as to why that was the choice, then there could be some resentment, right? And there, there's so many stories about siblings, fighting over money, and I think a lot of it is just a lack of communication, people not understanding what the wishes of their parents were, right? So more important than anything is really having those conversations. And along with that is also letting them know, like, where is the will, and how do you get access to our online accounts, and where are all the investments and what bank accounts, that's all important along those lines too, right? And then the other thing I'd say is that a legacy doesn't always have to be made on death. It could also be, living legacies, right? So we have a lot of clients now who it's very clear they're never going to spend all their money. And, their kids are maybe approaching retirement, and they're kind of scrambling a bit to get their kids through university and things like that. So it's okay to give money now too, right? So think about, do you want your kids to get a really big lump sum when you pass away, or would you like to be able to see them kind of enjoy some of that? Now, I did recommend a book to you guys before we jumped on here, The Millionaire Next Door. And it actually talks about a lot of reasons why you don't want to give your kids money. But I would say that's probably earlier on because it forms a bit of dependence and expectations. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And there's a lot of examples of why that's not. But once you're already retired and you're going to be okay and you're not spending that money and your kids have already figured it out on their own and you just want to give them a bit of a boost or help them out. I mean, I think that's a reasonable goal to have, or something to at least have a conversation with. And then when it comes to charitable plan giving, it's the same thing. I mean, there's a number of ways to give. You could give through your will. You could give more money now. If you have, life insurance policies that you don't think you need anymore, you could also assign those to charity. And it's a way to kind of increase the impact, because you could probably give a lot more through that life insurance policy that you got 20 years ago that you barely pay anything for, as opposed to actually leaving the money. So it's really, it's getting clear on your goals, communication, and understanding all your options, I guess, are the three things I would narrow it down to.
Amazing. Joe, you have been such a wealth of information. We are so appreciative of the time that you've given to us to be a guest on the podcast. And I just want to encourage listeners to check out Joe's website, matthewsandassociates.ca. That's where you'll find the Retirement Navigator, and also a connection to the podcast, Your Retirement Planning Simplified. So again, Joe, thank you so much.
Well, it's been fun being on here, and I appreciate you guys having me. So thank you.
Mary Ellen, Joe made some very good points. And one thing that I latched onto was the concept of having buckets of money, and some for short-term and long-term financial needs. So, no matter how large or not large your nest egg happens to be, having some saved for a rainy day, or to help prop up your long-term investments is something that I think some of us may overlook, because of obviously there's a lot of immediate needs, but having in the back of your mind that short-term money might become very important to your long-term plans as well.
Yeah. And I had never really thought about what he calls the defense bucket, right? That's your retirement income and the really paying yourself, right? So you'll have other sources of income, government pension and so on and so forth. But the whole point of your investments really is to be able to provide you with an income, fill in that gap between your expenses and whatever that gap that exists between the expenses and your income from other sources once you're retired, right? And no longer getting the paycheck.
Yeah.
So I really liked that. Like you said, the visual, right, of the buckets. And then having the offense bucket or the long-term bucket, those are your investments that you don't touch. They're intended to grow over time. And that's what you dip into occasionally to replenish the short-term or the defense bucket. And that really made sense to me. I liked that visual.
And, I think it's in part generational. And I have to come to grips with the fact that I'm now the old dog learning new tricks. But right. I think we watched our parents, like it was so important to, debt was not anything you wanted to be in if you could help it, and you wanted to save money right up until you're gone. And that now that, especially in working on the podcast and interviewing people doing so many interesting things, it obviously the light bulb comes on and says, well, yeah, I want to leave a legacy, but this money is important. Like it now is the time to pay myself, like you said, from my investments or from whatever I can do, or maybe it's something for extra income. But I think it's ingrained into us that save.
Yeah.
And a couple other things that Joe mentioned too about checking in on a regular basis on your portfolio. I was terrible on that. It was just put away, and I couldn't give you a total that might be in there, or what's interest, what's happening with interest. I wouldn't have a clue. So with additional time on my hands too, I tend to be a little more hands-on, and communication with your family about your plans. And this will come up again later in the season. We know that from interviews we've already done, but that is so important that someone other than you knows where things are and how to access them and what you want done with that money.
Yeah. I mean, we cannot stress enough the importance of communicating really in any area of life, but certainly the importance of communicating with your family in order to avoid issues later, right? It's so important to have a family meeting. And again, it may be uncomfortable, but the more you can normalize it, and we talked about that when we did the legacy episode in season 1, if you can normalize talking about your wishes for your passing and your wishes for what's to be done with whatever you're leaving behind, it normalizes it. And so that's going to really help the loved ones that you leave behind. It's going to comfort them in knowing that they're carrying out your wishes. They know what those wishes are. You've talked about it regularly. And it's really just going to make things a little bit easier at what is a very difficult time for people.
No, for sure. It's funny when you were saying that too. I was thinking that you may want to appoint vastly different people who would be your executor, and that person who may be making medical decisions, because one of them you got to take emotion out of, both really, but especially that latter one, because it would be a different type of person that may be a good executor. But that's maybe a whole other episode down the line, or just something that bounces around in my head. One last thing about Joe's advice that I would reiterate is his point about considering a financial gift prior to your death. We think about it's in the will, they'll get it then and open it up, and the people that we cared the most for will hopefully have some sort of legacy left to them. Joe mentioned that sometimes parents are a little hesitant to want to give too much too early, because then the children may become reliant on that money. But once they're older and they're becoming a little more financially secure, but always probably could use more, that may be a time to consider a gift prior to passing, or you may consider a gift to a charity or whatever else is near and dear to your heart. And honestly, I don't think that would have occurred to me outside of listening to Joe. So I think that's an important nugget that he left with me to consider. And I guess selfishly, you would also see the appreciation for the gift. And that's not what it's necessarily about, but who doesn't like some appreciation?
Oh, there you go. There you go. The one of the books that Joe recommended actually in talking about that was called The Millionaire Next Door. And we'll put a link to that both on the website and on our socials. That's an excellent book to check out if you find yourself with some time on your hands. We really appreciated the time that Joe gave us, two interviews, and not to mention running Matthew and Associates and having a young family and running a podcast. I mean, the man is very busy. We're really, really appreciative of the generosity with his time. And he did such a great job explaining financial planning to us, and I hope to listeners. So again, if you're looking for that retirement navigator that Joe referenced, it can be found at retirementplanningsimplified.ca. Check out his podcast. It's also available at that website, and his podcast is called Your Retirement Planning Simplified. So from Dave and I, we're going to take some much needed time with family and be back with you January 5th. We hope that you have a great time over the next few weeks celebrating whatever you're celebrating, whether it be Christmas or Kwanzaa, or just time with family. Happy New Year to all. And please, again, if you have the opportunity, please consider donating to a food bank. We'll be back with you on January 5th, and we're going to talk about working after retirement when we see you next. Yeah. So until then, I'm Mary Ellen.
And I'm Dave.
Stay well.
You have been listening to the Retirement Years Podcast. Web design by Gavin Hinton. Social media marketing and management provided by Madison Sloan at MSS Mad Media. Original music by Theodora Draper.